Hello, and thank you for wanting to listen to my presentation on the coming paradigm shift of the neuroscience of compassion for medical education and clinical practice. My name is Dominic Vachon. I'm a medical psychologist. I've spent most of my career training physician residents. For the last 10 years, I've been a professor of the practice and director of the Hillebrand Center for Compassionate Care in Medicine at the University of Notre Dame. I'm also involved in some work as a volunteer clinical faculty at the Indiana University School of Medicine in South Bend, Indiana. The Hillebrand Center at Notre Dame works to restore the spirit of compassion in healthcare by advancing the application of this new science of compassion at every level of medical training and practice. We are developing programs applying the science of compassion to practice and training, beginning at the pre-medical stage, and then in medical school and residency, also in continuing medical education, and at the systems and organizational level. What I'd like to do is give you a little bit of the context for this paradigm change in terms of the need for it, give you an overview of what the science of compassion is and a couple of examples about it, and then finally discuss a little bit of the implications for medical training. When I was on faculty at the residency program, I watched residents go through major psychological challenges. First, I thought they were blindsided by the emotional challenges of residency. Everything from the exhausting schedule, the intensity of working with very difficult patients, the dysfunctional healthcare system dynamics, the sacrifice of their personal lives. The other challenge was that the sentimentalized notions of caring and compassion that they had bringing them into medical school and then into residency were unable to sustain them as they were going through this. They had to find ways to salvage these, or they had to find new ways to imagine their clinical work. And often that meant that they came to the conclusion that compassionate care was an unrealistic and unhelpful ideal, and that the norm was really emotional detachment, or living in a cynical, resentful way and somehow making it through a career that way. This raised the question for me about how do I assist residents in forming and sustaining their inner attitude, their clinician mindset. Now, in terms of challenges I experienced to training the internal attitudes of residents, one of the first challenges was that residents came from a spectrum of previous training and communication skills, ranging from not very good to excellent. But almost always there was a hidden curriculum biased against fully improving communication skills, much less working on the inner attitude of how do you sustain a caring and compassionate attitude with difficult patients and in a very dysfunctional healthcare system. Secondly, the other challenge is that communication skills training is distinct from training the inner attitude or the clinical mindset. The two are thought independent, but the inner attitude heavily influences the communication skills. A third challenge is that medical competence and compassionate caring are often considered two distinct things, when in fact they are one and the same. But people will often think of compassionate caring as a non-essential adjunct to medical practice. Fourth, I found that residents in general did not have a very sophisticated understanding of the role of emotions in medicine, either in their patient or in themselves. And then finally, I really saw the lack of having an integrated theory that brings together what is going on inside a clinician as they're encountering challenging patients and trying to apply their wonderful competence that they gained from medical school in the middle of a grueling schedule. Now, at the medical student level, the challenges are similar. In medical school, there's a grueling regimen of learning high amounts of basic medical knowledge, which makes the training and communication skills feel less important. And so what happens is students don't often put a lot of energy into the communication skills training. And it's accepted that it's a secondary priority. Another challenge is that compassionate care is often viewed as soft, imprecise, and non-essential, even though compassion and caring is most often the motivation for people wanting to go to medical school. And then again, another challenge which shows up in residency is that communication skills training is often not discussed in conjunction with what's going on with the inner clinical attitude. And generally, there's no formal training in terms of the inner attitude or the clinical mindset, except with exposure to good role models, good attendings, or seeking out really good supervision on this. And then finally, medical school lacks an integrated model that ties all of these together. Now, what happened for me about 10 years ago was that I encountered the science of compassion, which solved a lot of these problems and has made the training at all these levels go much better. And I want to give you an overview of that. When I use the term science of compassion, what I mean is that compassion is studied as an empirical, scientific phenomenon that has central importance in the medical professions. In other words, we're looking at compassion in a non-sentimentalized way. So the science of compassion studies compassion from a biological point of view, from an evolutionary biology point of view. The neuroscience of compassion is now a very popular type of study. Also, the psychology and other social sciences, their contribution to the science of compassion. But this has all been bumped up to a whole new level in the last decade. My exposure came in 2012 with the first research conference on the science of compassion in Telluride, Colorado. And from there in 2014, there was a second research conference on the science of compassion. Compassion in 2012 and 2014 conferences was discussed in a very general way in terms of everything from societal dynamics, parenting, child development, economics, politics, culture, and a little bit on healthcare. But in 2014, a whole day was spent on applying science of compassion to healthcare. From there, things have evolved very quickly. In 2017, Oxford published a handbook on compassion science, which reviews all the research on compassion from all the various disciplines, including biology, psychology, neuroscience, sociology, and so on. And then last year, Drs. Treziak and Mazzarelli reviewed all the empirical literature on compassion and caring variables and really found overwhelming evidence for how compassion makes a very large difference in terms of not only patient satisfaction, but actual medical outcomes, clinician well-being, and even the efficiency and profitability of healthcare organizations. Last year, I published this book, How Doctors Care, The Science of Compassionate and Balanced Caring in Medicine, through Cognella Academic Publishing. And in this book, what I did was, first of all, discuss what the neuroscience of compassion teaches us and how that we can actually do this in practice. And in the second half of the book, I review how to be balanced in compassionate caring in clinical practice. What the scientific understanding of compassion in medicine provides us is a way to link medical competence with a clinician's compassionate caring inner attitude. Those two are seen as one and the same. Secondly, theoretical and practical linkages are more explicit between what counts as explicit patient care, but also that is related to how a clinician takes care of him or herself. And finally, a scientific understanding of compassion even gives us knowledge for organizational and systemic factors, as well as individual training interventions that affect the clinician compassion mindset. I'm thinking of this time as Hubble Telescope time. That is, that the science of compassion is like the Hubble Telescope for the helping professions. So compassion has been with us ever since we've been human. But just like the Hubble Telescope revealed to us distant galaxies that we had no idea existed, nor did we have any idea of the amazing wonders that's revealed to us, now using tools like biology and neuroscience, we're able to get a much deeper understanding of what compassion is. And in doing that, it is clarified some of the things that are just plain wrong that we're doing in medical training, and also directs us how to do medical training and clinical practice and clinician care, self-care, much better than what we've done so far. If I were to give you the highlights in terms of what the science of compassion is helping us do better in terms of training as well as clinical practice, these would be the high points. First of all, it gives us an in-depth understanding of the neuroscience of emotional connection with patients. What's going on in the patient, what's going on in the clinician that constitutes really good connection. And what happens when there's not good connection. And looking at not only the psychological levels, but the physiological levels. Also, science of compassion gives us a much more in-depth understanding of the neuroscience of empathy. And also the dangerous myth of emotional detachment. That because of the science of compassion, we are very clear that living a life of emotional detachment as a clinician is dangerous not only for the patient, it's dangerous for the clinician. Science of compassion also helps us understand the important role of emotions in the healing process, both for the patient and the clinician. One of the amazing discoveries that I'm going to highlight in a moment is that we've discovered that empathy is distinct from compassion. And what occurs is that compassion is actually the undercarriage, the chassis of the car, so to speak, for empathy. It's what allows us to carry the empathy without being overwhelmed by it. Another implication of the science of compassion is that it has pointed the way for how we train our medical student and resident and even pre-medical student minds to be able to prepare to do a work that is so emotionally challenging like medicine, and do it in a way that's rooted in compassionate caring. Science of compassion has really clarified how compassion for the patient is linked with clinician well-being. That when we aren't compassionate to patients, we are not only harming patients, we're harming ourselves. And we can really see that at the neuroscientific level. And so it's pointed the way in terms of how do we understand what's balance in compassionate caring? What helps us find the clinician compassion mindset, and when have we fallen out of it? And what can we do to recover that compassion mindset when we fall out of it? And finally, the science of compassion has really helped us understand that compassion itself appears to be a buffer against burnout. Let me give you a couple of examples of science of compassion and its applicability to medicine. First of all, one of the major discoveries is that empathy is different than compassion. And this is based on the work of Singer and Klemeshky, but actually many other neuroscientists. So in working with clinicians now, we can teach them that clinician empathy for patient suffering can go in one of two directions. It can go in one direction, which we'd call empathic distress, where the clinician is overwhelmed with empathizing with the suffering of the patient. Or the other pathway is the compassion mindset. In terms of empathic distress, what happens here is when a clinician is empathizing with patient suffering, but they are vicariously experiencing the negative emotions of the patient. They don't have a clear self-other distinction. The feelings all merge together. And as a result, what happens is the clinician becomes overwhelmed emotionally and starts to focus on his or her own distress. So what ends up happening is that clinicians start protecting themselves from empathic distress by withdrawing emotionally, by emotional detachment, or they use a distancing maneuver. So there might be a subtle or explicit hostility as a way to get distance, or the other thing that happens is they become emotionally over-involved with patients because they're trying to take care of their own distress, and that leads them deeper and deeper into doing things that really aren't helpful to the patient or themselves. Compassion is a distinct mental state that holds the empathy in a way that's much more beneficial for the patient and for the clinician. What happens here is that the clinician transforms their empathic resonance into understanding the patient's condition. They are able to maintain a self-other distinction. Contrary to what people think, when people are in a compassion mindset, they aren't overwhelmed by emotions. They are actually more centered, more emotionally regulated, and more able to apply the competence, all the skills that they've learned in medical school or in residency or fellowship. They're able to apply those skills in a very centered state. But it's all in a state of positive concern for the patient and a desire to help them. They're motivated to respond to patient suffering, but they have a good sense of boundaries in that, but they're very engaged and focused on helping that patient. Now, as one example of this from an fMRI perspective, neuroscience has really shown how compassion and empathy actually rely on different neural networks in the brain. What's key here is the training aspect, helping students, for example, or physicians in practice learn how to manage their empathy so that it doesn't overwhelm them or make them want to withdraw, and instead helps them find this balance, which we call the compassion mindset. That involves training. And the science of compassion has really paved the way for us to do this teaching much better than we have before. A second example I want to give you of the implications of the science of compassion in medicine is about how to achieve balance in this work. So think to yourself, how would you graph the effects of clinician emotional involvement on the patient? In other words, if you are negatively emotionally involved with a patient, you're abusive to the patient, you are negative in some way, what is the effect on patient outcomes when you're like that? When you're neutral with a patient, what's the effect on your patient? When you're emotionally over-involved with your patient, what's the effect on your patient? And graph that on an XY axis, where the x-axis is your level of emotional involvement with the patient, and the y-axis is the effects on the patient. Well, the research really ends up looking like this graph. So you can see here at point number 1 that when you are negatively involved with a patient, that is going to have severe negative effects on the patient in terms of not only patient satisfaction, but also patient medical outcomes and them following through with medical regimens that you recommend. At point 2, you're not as negative, you're more neutral and detached working with the patient, so its effect on the patient is not as bad as if you are abusive toward the patient. On the other hand, it still has somewhat negative effects on the patient because of this detachment. And again, all of this is very clear in the research literature. At point 5, when you're over-involved with patients, that also has a negative effect on patients. And that's for many reasons, as we are all probably very well acquainted, that when we do too much for patients, we make them dependent on us, and we don't help them learn how to take care of themselves better because they're so dependent on us. The optimum range, the zone of balanced caring, is points 3 and 4. And you can see that there's a rather wide range of emotional involvement, covering a wide range of patient-centered styles that all have positive effects. Now, ask yourself, how would you graph the effects of clinician emotional involvement with the patient on the clinician? In other words, when you are negatively emotionally involved with the patient, what's the effect on you as the clinician? If you are over-involved with the patient, what's the effect on you as the clinician? Same idea. Research points in this direction, and it's exactly the same curve. What we see in the literature is that when clinicians are negatively involved with patients, it's actually harmful to them as clinicians, not just the patients. When we are neutral or detached with our patients, it's not as negative for us, but it's still somewhat negative for us. Point number 5, when we're over-involved with patients, that's definitely harmful to us, definitely has negative effects on clinicians. And again, points 3 and 4, this optimum range, a range of balance in the way you care for your patients, that zone has a range of positive effects for the clinician. Now, to train this, what we need to do is train our students and our residents and people in practice in terms of solidifying these four areas of balanced compassionate caring. To find this zone of balanced caring, we have to work on explicitly articulating and training the underlying attitudes that support the clinician compassion mindset. It's not just attitudes, however. We have to work on concrete practices and concrete skills that make the clinician compassion mindset sustainable. Thirdly, the biggest predictor of compassion is what is going on in an organization, in a system, in a culture. Those can make or break the individual clinician's compassion mindset. So we need to teach our students about this. And then finally, the underlying, every person has an underlying philosophy of life or a spirituality of caring that they rely on as they help their patients. We are in medicine constantly encountering people who are going through some of the worst things human beings can go through. And what happens to us as clinicians is that we have to go to our philosophy of life or our spirituality to help us figure out how we're going to orient ourselves living a life where we're trying to care for others while we're trying to care for ourselves at the same time. So now widening again after those two examples, the implications for us in terms of training and practice is that the scientific study of compassion using methods that we have not had available to us before are going to enable us to really help people in medicine understand the neuroscience of connecting with patients, and how it is not only a warm bedside manner that makes everybody feel good, it actually has major implications in terms of medical outcomes and what's happening inside the clinician, especially in the long term in terms of burnout or compassion satisfaction. We have ways now of being able to teach a balanced way of being empathic and to talk about how emotional detachment is a defense and one that we really have to be really cautious about because it's dangerous if we do it in the long run. We're getting better at helping clinicians understand how emotions are integral to the healing process. And as I've already talked about, how empathy is different than compassion, and then how do we train ourselves to be in this compassion mindset? Because what we're discovering is that it is not only beneficial for the patient, it's intimately tied to our well-being over the long run. It's actually a buffer against burnout. In terms of pre-medical training, this is also a real opportunity for us, and one that we are pursuing at the Hillebrand Center at Notre Dame. And our thought is, why are we waiting until medical school and residency to train our students in this science? These skills and this mindset are developmental, and they're more able to mature if we begin in a less stressful period of the student's training. One of the problems in medical school is that it's a really stressed time. So when we ask people to work on their inner attitude, their emotions, their communication skills, it's really hard to compete with feeling overwhelmed by all the information that has to be learned. So what we've discovered is that when we have started this at the pre-medical stage, it allows these skills to mature and a number of habits of the compassion mindset to be solidified, and actually helps them through medical school and residency. We've done this now for 10 years. We just finished a survey on this and gotten very positive feedback from students all the way from first year medical school through second year in residency. It's also a way to prepare to navigate the hidden curriculum in medical school and residency. At the pre-medical level, we are doing courses covering all the bases in terms of the science of compassion. So compassionate care in medicine outlines the neuroscience of compassion and also what is the zone of balanced compassionate caring and how do we get there and what do we do when we fall out of that balanced zone. To begin exposing pre-medical students to medical counseling skills, we use paid actors who do simulations with the students, and we try to do skills that are not covered deeply in medical school, and that in that way prepare them to use those communication skills even better when they get to patient care. We do a spiritualities of caring course in which students are exposed to about 12 clinicians, all from different religious and philosophical backgrounds, everywhere from traditional religions and spiritualities to compassionate atheism and compassionate agnosticism. And we do other courses as well that supplement this training in the science of compassion. If you are interested in getting further information about this, please feel free to contact me at my email address here on the slide. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and I appreciate your interest in this. Thank you.